Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome to another countdown. We return to the world of Hey Arnold to talk about its second season. Season 2 is a very transitional season. It's not as character or theme building as Season 1, but it's not as character development focused as Season 3. It finds a middle ground between the two, and transitions from one to the other very well. For how short and undefined it is, even though it's not one of my favorites, it's still a great season with a solid list of episodes and some killer highs. It's a nice follow-up to the great first season and a good setup to the amazing third season. Because it's sandwiched in between those two seasons, it ends up being a jack of all traits, which gives such a short season much variety along with quality. It does a lot of different and interesting things with such a short list of episodes. As I said, there are some amazing episodes here, and for many different reasons. And because this season is a lot less defined than the last one, it made the list a lot more interesting and a lot harder at the same time to make. There really weren't any episodes this season that I thought showed off what Season 2 overall tried to achieve at its best when it went about dealing with different topics for its episodes, which made the list much harder to make, as I've already said, because there weren't those few episodes that were dead set on making the top of the list. That doesn't mean this list isn't as good as the Season 1 list, but it does mean the best episodes were way closer in quality because there just wasn't a clear-cut winner, and comparing them was much harder because of that. I debated the entries and order a lot, and am even going back and forth on if I made the wrong or right choice right now. Heck, when making the list, I even made some last-minute decisions while writing the script. That's how close it was, and that's how much I thought over putting these episodes in order. So once again, this is all just my opinion, and if nothing else, I could definitely see my mind changing in the future, whereas for Season 1, I feel confident that list is going to stay where it is for a very long time. So, take most of these entries with a grain of salt, and if one episode makes it higher than another, just know I love everything here, including the honorable mentions I'm going to talk about later, and they were all very close in quality. But for now, this is where I stand, and this is my list, so let's get right into it, and hopefully not make this video an hour long. Here is my top 5 best Hey Arnold Season 2 episodes. I think after rewatching the season and placing these episodes on this list, I think I grew to appreciate pretty much all of them a lot more. And this episode is definitely one of the biggest examples. This was always an episode I found very overrated, and I don't mean in a pizza delivery kind of way, where I thought it was one of the best, but didn't quite love it as much as everyone else. No, for the longest time, I thought this episode was good, but nothing particularly above that. And when I heard people calling it one of the best, I never understood why. And even on rewatches, while it did grow on me, I still didn't love it. But watching it again for this list, all of a sudden, it just clicked with me. Obviously, I don't think it's one of the absolute best. It's still just number 5 on the list, but it is an exceptional episode that deserves all the love it gets. The concept is just genius. Seeing Helga and Arnold go to the opera and them both falling asleep during different parts of the show to dream about their own interpretations of that show, using people from their lives and their own desires, is so interesting. We get to see them both act out their own interpretation of this with so many great moments and jokes and an amazing use of music. So many classic pieces are used throughout this episode in so many creative ways, and we even get some fun renditions using the Hey Arnold cast. And that's a great way to sum this episode up. Fun and creative. You never know where this episode is going to go next, and it goes as far as it possibly can with its concept. It's just a joyride and really has it all. Not only does it go as far as it can with its concept, but once again, it uses so many different pieces of music in so many interesting ways, and uses all its characters in great and fitting ways. Along with having so much fun with the setting, doing so much with that as well, and just telling joke after joke with it. It's also really cool how this fun setup does lead to them showing off some interesting stuff about these characters on top of that. Yeah, it is kind of weird that both of their dreams kinda happen right after each other's, and Arnold still likes Ruth in this episode, even though this takes place after Arnold's Valentine's. I know the show doesn't follow continuity, but that did seem like a very important thing that they did want to stick to, because they did change the status quo, as you will see later. And yeah, as I said in my last video, that part of Arnold's Valentine's does make that special more impactful as a finale to season 1. And that's why when watching this episode in the past, that plus the other problem I mentioned used to really bother me, but honestly, I don't care anymore because of how far this episode takes its concept because of all the elements I mentioned. It really checks off all the marks, including some fun action as well, and giving us some interesting depictions of our characters through this concept. Maybe Arnold doesn't like Ruth anymore. I mean, he probably does, but maybe he just still is kind of interested in her even after that. Maybe he wants to still like her, but doesn't really because, you know, of what happened. And maybe this fantasy he's having is a world where he can still like her, and she is interesting, and she is what he wants her to be, because this is just a dream and a fantasy. Because during the rest of the episode, he really doesn't give off the indication that he likes her anymore. Yeah, there's the little scene at the beginning where it looks like he might still be interested in her, but all he was doing was just kind of looking at her. That's no proof, and that's more to make Helga super jealous and to set up her aspect of the episode. Obviously, I'm not as sure how much I buy into either of the things I just mentioned, but it is still cool that the episode does leave it vague enough for you to take what you want out of it. And it does make this episode way more interesting and gives it an edge which it wouldn't have just being a really fun episode that does all these cool things. And yeah, this episode is very much a spectacle first and foremost, and is just showing off our characters in this fun opera show like setting, doing cool and exciting things, with the character stuff not really being a selling point, because once again, it's really more what you take out of these weird scenes, and some of the stuff, like the Ruth thing, can just be going back to the original status quo and the show not having concrete continuity. But it is still more of an additional added bonus, which adds to the whole picture. But if you don't get anything out of this spectacle, the episode might fall apart for you, and I get that. Also, Hey Arnold can be a very emotional and story-driven show that deals with some very heavy topics. And there are better episodes this season that do just that, which is why for me personally, it is as low as it is, because I do think Hey Arnold can just do so much more, and there were episodes that just, man, really knocked it out of the park with what they tried to achieve, and tackled some very complex stuff. But sometimes, true spectacle and a full use of a very fun concept wins out over something with much more layers. Speaking of, wow, a Hey Arnold list where a special didn't take first place. I'm totally not spoiling anything for later, guys. But yeah, this is the only special of the second season, and just because it isn't any higher doesn't mean it's not great. As I hinted at earlier, this episode is mostly here because of the spectacle of this prank that's gone awry and all the crazy things that happen because of it on this very interesting Halloween night. But I put this episode higher than What's Up, Arnold because it has more time to flesh everything out due to the fact it is a special. So because of that, the first half of this episode really has the time to set up this story well, along with having that amazing Halloween time atmosphere. Once again, Hey Arnold, especially these early specials, have incredible atmosphere, and this is no exception. You really get to see all these little elements of the episode's story, whether it be the main plot or the different subplots, get shown off before the actual prank of the episode gets pulled, which sets all the main events into place. Let's back up a little bit and talk about what the actual plot of the episode is. This episode is about Arnold and Gerald pulling a prank at the boarding house, trying to trick everyone into thinking aliens have landed. And they go pretty far with it too, even tricking their classmates who were dressed up as aliens to show up to make this prank as authentic and as fooling as possible, but they accidentally broadcast their message across the city, which leads to the city going awry and to a bunch of crazy things happening, including their friends getting chased around all night by a multitude of people and them trying to put things right. And once everything pops off, it's such a wild and tense ride. There is so much great stuff going on, and it leads to a kick-ass series of events. From Arnold trying to set this right, to the classmates dressed as aliens running away from a bunch of different people, and Big Bob being this alien hunter, to even that crazy nutjob UFO Tonight guy playing into this and making the situation 10 times worse. So much happens, which keeps you on the edge of your seat because you never know what's going to transpire next, and you don't want to see any of these kids who didn't even know they were pulling a prank in the first place get hurt, and you want to see Arnold and Gerald set things right because of how badly they've messed up, and because of just how much is going on, and it balances all these subplots perfectly. And all these different aspects just makes it all so much more interesting, and because their negative actions cause so many bad things, it makes you care so much more. The episode also has so many good jokes and little moments on top of that, and it is a fun parody of real life events, while going super far with how this event could have unfolded in the most strange ways on Halloween because of all these great elements I mentioned. So yeah, this is one of the most exciting and complete Halloween specials you will ever see. It doesn't have an emotional core like the last two specials did, but it tells such a great story that's really intense and with so much added in to make the episode as great as possible, while balancing it all perfectly. but there are 3 episodes this season that tackle really interesting topics with a lot more to bite into than this episode offers. But don't get me wrong, this episode is great, and they barely beat this one out. Now this is Hey Arnold when it wants to deal with a complex subject matter. Eugene Goes Bad, or as I like to call it, the story of a hero, is without a doubt Eugene's best episode. The problem with most Eugene episodes is the writers seem to think the only plot they can get out of him is, oh, he's super unlucky and Arnold has to keep trying to make him happy and make up for all his misfortunes. And if I didn't like it that much the first time when they did it near the beginning of the show, you can bet how much I hate it when they do it 2 more times, once in the season even. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and that's for another time. No, the reason why this episode is great is because it dives into who Eugene is as a person and how his unluckiness and other attributes affect how he views himself through his hero. This episode is about his journey after he finds out his hero isn't the person he wants him to be. And given that his hero, the Abdicator, is his role model, he decides to go bad and become the worst version of himself he can possibly be. Not only is this a great character study of Eugene and how this person who inspires him and makes him strive to be the best person he can possibly be, even with the disadvantages in his life, but what happens when that's taken away from him. It also shows how dangerous it is to have a hero and put him on such a high pedestal that they could never live up to, and the consequences because of that. Not just because of how he changes himself, but because of how it affects other people. And I don't mean the people he is a jerk to, I mean the people who look up to him. There's another boy in this episode who looks up to Eugene as a hero, and when he turns bad and has no sympathy for this kid, he decides to go bad as well. The whole story and deep dive into Eugene's character and how this weird aspect of his life can affect someone in more ways than one is all so well paced and introduced and looked at. Eugene's turn doesn't feel forced. It feels like a natural progression because of the events in the episode and how they play out. Eugene doesn't pull a full 180, and at worst, just becomes more inconsiderate to other people, and more of a person who just does a few bad things, which actually makes this portion of the episode kind of funny because of how he actually isn't that bad and more does a few petty acts, and that callback to False Alarm is amazing. It feels very in line with his character. If he ever were to go bad, this is about how far he would actually go. But even seeing that change is so jarring compared to how Eugene usually is, and you really want him to snap out of this because of that, making the situation really complex as once again a great deep dive into his character, but also because of the thematic elements of this story as well. The kid in this episode who looks up to Eugene could have felt incredibly forced and shoehorned in to push this whole hero aspect or a message, but he feels like a natural part of the story that adds a lot. I believe there would be a younger kid looking up to Eugene as an inspiration in some way, just like Eugene looks up to the Advocator. Because of how Eugene presents himself and how he always picks himself back up and tries to be the best person he can possibly be even in the worst situations. And when Eugene goes bad and it causes the other kid to do the same, it leads me to the ending. when the kid gets himself in trouble trying to copy Eugene in his bad lifestyle, you think it's just gonna be a generic ending where Eugene saves the kid and they realize it's wrong to put all your faith into someone you look up to and should still try to be a good person even if your idol isn't. Which would have been fitting, I guess, and is a good message, but I don't think it's the interesting and complex ending an episode like this deserves. But no, that's not where they go with this. Actually, Eugene tries to help him and completely fails, in a funny Eugene fashion. But then, his hero from earlier, the Abdicator, comes back into the story to rescue both of them in a pretty tense scene. So the Abdicator has appeared a few other times in this episode after Eugene called him out and went bad after that. And he's been debating on how he feels about the whole event and how he wants to go about certain things after this because of how sad it makes him that a fan of his was completely hurt by him just kind of being a jerk one day. And he wants to make it up to him somehow and just present himself better in general. And when Eugene is in trouble, he sees this as an opportunity to be a real hero to this kid. After seeing him debate how he wants to go about being a hero to people, to see him finally come to this decision when he decides to save Eugene and this other kid and set a good example to them is really cool. And the episode ends off on a great note where it says, yeah, it's great to look up to someone. That's a good thing and it can be really good, but it's wrong to put that person on such a high pedestal, and people make mistakes, but that shouldn't cause you to be a worse person because your hero doesn't live up to every expectation you have for them. We should all strive to be the best people we can possibly be, because people may look up to you and they might get bad impressions because of that. It's just so interesting and there's so much to dive into, and it leaves the episode off on such an open-ended note because there's just so much you can take out of this. That's really what I get out of the ending, but there's just so much more, which makes this episode so complex and ends it on that amazing note that it really deserved. So yeah, this is such an interesting episode that deals with so many things in a great way. There are very few episodes like it, even in Hey Arnold, and it is Eugene's best appearance to date. It shows off such an interesting cycle of life and what it really means to be a hero on a big or small scale, and the responsibility to be a good person because of that, even if you don't know other people are looking up to you. Man, talking about this episode in such depth makes me want to put it at number 1. How the hell is it only number 3? What could be better? I've made this list so many times in the past for fun, as I said earlier, and each of them, this episode would always come out on top, except just recently when I rewatched the episodes. I told you this list was hard to make, but let's put this aside for now and talk about why this episode is as high as it is. As I said in my last video, Harold is my favorite Hey Arnold character that isn't Arnold or Helga. And while Harold's bar mitzvah is the first episode that really shows off how interesting of an episode they can get out of this character, this episode here is the episode that really endears you to the character. Every time I watch this episode, I hate Harold in the beginning. I find him so incredibly annoying because of the way he treats and talks to everyone else, and even threatens to beat up a cat just to show how manly and strong he is to Arnold. And in any other episode, this would be a huge problem, because this is the main character we're gonna follow throughout this story, and, at least at the beginning, he is not fun to watch. But this episode uses that opening bit to its fullest advantage. Once you see him play with the cat and form a bond with it after he takes it in while Arnold tries to look for its owner, in a pretty fun montage, you grow to really like Harold and start to piece together why he acts the way he does, and how he may be dealing with some developmental issues, and how great it is for him to have this cat that makes him really happy. All this is shown off really well, and by the middle of the episode, you grow to really like Harold, and see him having this cat as a good thing for him. Sure, it's not helping him deal with any of his issues, and might even make him more excluded from other people, but he loves this cat so much, and takes such good care of it, that you feel like he deserves to keep it in his life, even though you know from the beginning that's just not gonna happen. And when you see Arnold put up signs and Harold gets mad even though he knew this was going to happen, you understand why he would feel this way, because he is a kid and he has grown such an attachment to this cat that even though he knew he would probably have to give it up, the fact that Arnold is trying to speed up the process with all these signs would feel like a betrayal to him. And that's where this episode gets really interesting, because not only is it a character study of Harold and making you really like him despite his faults, hell, even because of his faults, but it also brings up a very interesting dilemma. That being, is having this cat actually a good thing for him? Especially because he might be even more isolated now than ever, and he's getting attached to something that doesn't belong to him, even though the cat makes him happy. But that gets into the other dilemma of the episode, which is that if this is a good thing for him, is it wrong to try to hold on to this cat? Obviously, yes, it is wrong, but it's still a dilemma I think a kid would go through in this situation, and it's interesting to watch. And the episode leaves it vague enough and up to interpretation enough for why he acts the way he does in general, and what could change that in other people's perception of him, which makes it pretty interesting, but it also makes you say, well, who cares? He likes this cat, and it makes this poor kid happy. Which I feel like I shouldn't be saying. I should want this kid to deal with his issues and explore certain aspects of his life in greater depth to better himself. But there's always another time for that, and for right now, I just want him to be happy. Which makes it even more interesting when the lady from earlier in the episode, who Harold annoyed, turns out to be the cat owner, and Harold refuses to give it up, leading to a very tense scene. Obviously, you want him to do the right thing, but at the same time, kind of want things to work out in a way where he can keep the cat. It's so weird. This episode just messes with you and your sense of what you want from any given situation involving Harold. But in the end, Arnold talks him into giving the cat back. I'll just say, I love Arnold's role in this episode. How he constantly tries to reach out to Harold and be as nice as he possibly can, but has to balance that with doing the right thing. He is a great stand-in for the audience, and is another interesting element in Harold's story. And in the end, even though no one shows any sympathy for this kid when he gives this cat up in a pretty sad scene that crushes me every single time. The old lady and Harold come to a compromise where even though they still admit they both don't like each other, she decides to let him hang out with the cat because of how good of a job he did taking care of it. And it ends with Harold being happy and the kid's perception of him changing for the better, even if they still think he is kind of weird. And that's still great in so many ways. So yeah, this is a heartwarming episode about Harold and his cat. That is really interesting because of how it shows off Harold's character and changes your perception on him, and through that brings up a very interesting dilemma in the subtext and lets you come to your own conclusion on it through having a very fun main plot. And as I said, this episode lets you piece together your own interpretation of it while still having that fun main plot. Through the plot actually being really simple. It has no right to be as fun and interesting as it is, but on the surface it's just fun to watch Harold hang out with this cat and see how it affects him in a positive way and see what happens when the cat gets taken away. But below that, you have all the interesting dilemmas and interesting character aspects that they explore in this episode, which just makes it so great. And that's why I like this episode more than something like Eugene Goes Bad, because I just find Harold's characterization and how they explore it in this episode a bit more interesting than how they explore Eugene in that episode, even though that episode might be a bit more in-depth and a bit more better paced and developed. I still like this one more because I just find it more interesting. And once again, it was so close to making number one. I love it so much. But in the end of the day, there was one other episode that I do think goes a bit further with its concept, and I just find a bit more interesting, if only by a little bit. Now, before we figure out what amazing episode topped this list at the very last second, we need to give credit to 11 other episodes that added to the season's greatness, but just missed the list. Mr. Simmons is a great character who adds a fun quirkiness to some of the school-centered episodes, and fits the show so well. And this is a great introduction to his character. They show him off in a pretty fun way, and not only show off why he makes a good teacher, but why the students want him. Yeah, this episode is kind of generic as its plot goes, but it does such a good job introducing Simmons in a fun way and telling many great jokes. This is a fun mystery episode with many great scenarios and good jokes that makes fun of how low the stakes are while exploring an interesting sister and brother dynamic in a pretty subtle way. The introduction to a character, I don't have many positive things to say about, but this is still a good introduction nonetheless. I like how they don't make Lila a love interest to anyone, at least not until later in the show. In this episode, she is just a brand new character. When I first watched this episode, I was sure they were gonna take her in the route where she was immediately going to be a love interest, but I was pleasantly surprised when they didn't. Yeah, she is still pretty bland here, and in most of the other episodes she's in, but what makes this episode so interesting is the other girls' reaction to her, and how their opinions change throughout the episode when they learn more about her. Also, this episode is pretty funny, though sometimes for unintentional reasons. Yeah, they kinda spell out the message at the end, and it is kinda generic if I'm being honest, but there's some really interesting character stuff here, and just a lot of good jokes that pulls it all together and makes the episode work really well. This is another episode I wasn't too crazy about until rewatching it, but now I've grown to really love it. It takes a fun concept that is a little bit cliched, but goes so much further than most episodes with that concept to show off many interesting aspects of Helga's character through really interesting and just a lot of different scenes. Obviously, Helga isn't going to turn into a monkey, but because of how this episode is set up, you understand why she as a kid might believe that that's what's gonna happen, and as I've already said, they just get so many great scenes and interesting moments out of that fear, which makes it all really engaging. A fun competition and legends episode all in one that really has the best of both worlds in it. The episode really makes you want to see Arnold and Gerald succeed at catching this strange creature they have been talking about, not to just win the competition, but also to prove that this thing is real when people have doubts. And when they finally do catch it, after a ton of build-up and an intense scene, they come to a very interesting conclusion that feels like the perfect ending to this kind of story. Yeah, there's nothing exceptional about this episode, but it succeeds at pretty much everything it tries to do, just like... This is a great episode with a very interesting story about responsibility and the value of $1, and how easy it is to get screwed over when trying to make easy cash, even when you're a kid. Heck, because you're a kid. It's just such a different and weird episode that puts Gerald through some very interesting trials for him to go through, and then shows him coming out of it learning a valuable lesson. Yeah, once again, there's nothing amazing here, but this is such a different and very adult episode compared to so many others in this season that it's very appreciated. A very fun competition episode where the kids play football against bullies. Yeah, it is kinda generic, but there's a ton of good jokes, and the episode has so much fun with its concept, showing off how these kids come together and win even when the odds are against them, and their original strategy isn't working. It's very satisfying to watch, either way, and once again, they just do so much with this concept, along with so many good jokes. Oh, this episode was so close to making the list. It's one of the most underrated episodes of the show, and I love it to pieces. It tackles a very unique concept that kids can relate to, and goes about it in such an interesting way, while exploring the family dynamic between Gerald and his family, while still taking this plot in very weird directions that just makes it so much more interesting. I have so much more I want to say about this episode, which is why I really wanted it to make the list. But What's Opera Arnold just went a bit further with its concept. Another amazing episode that was very close to making the list. It really dives in to Phoebe's character and how she always tries to be the best at everything, and what happens when that just isn't possible, which leads to them showing off how the guilt of cheating, mixed with this notion of always having to be the best, really affects her. It's so interesting, but there are other episodes that once again just go further with their concepts they try to tackle, or I just think the concept that they try to tackle is a bit more interesting. This episode was one I really did expect to make the list after rewatching it, but obviously it didn't. It does go super far with showing off just what Helga's crush on Arnold means to her, and how it affects her when it's taken away. And I can deeply relate to that feeling of emptiness she feels for personal reasons. It probably dives into the significance of Helga's crush on Arnold and how it affects pretty much every aspect of herself more than any other episode, and Helga is the most interesting character on the show, with this being one of, if not the most interesting part of her. So why didn't it make the list? Honestly, I don't know. It sounds like it would, but there's always been something about this episode that doesn't quite click with me compared to other examples of the season. And I can't quite pinpoint why, if it's just I think the other episodes go a bit further with their concepts, or their concepts in general are just a bit more interesting. I'm not quite sure. On paper, this seems like it'd be the most interesting episode ever, and watching it, I think it kind of is, but I don't know, there's just a part of me that's never been able to fully get into this episode, and maybe on rewatches, I'll figure it out, and heck, maybe on rewatches, I'll fully come around and embrace that I love this episode, and it'll make the list proper, but for right now, it's just an honorable mention. A very sweet episode that deals with an interesting issue in a fun way. You're really rooting for Gerald to succeed in this episode because you understand why this would happen and why Gerald is hesitant to learn how to ride a bike at this point in his life, being an older kid and having bad experiences in the past. So it's very satisfying to see him come around on this and learn while doing a really good job biking in the end because of that and because of all the different things he's done throughout the episode thanks to Arnold's help, and getting over this weird fear of biking and thinking that it's too late for him to learn. Also, as someone whose basically other hobby is biking a ton, when Gerald goes down that steep hill as a new biker afraid of getting in an accident, I'm on the edge of my seat because I like Gerald and I've been in some pretty bad bike accidents before, which helps a lot. But with that, let's finish this list and finally get into my... Man, this is another episode. I didn't realize just how amazing it was until I rewatched it. As I said, literally last second, in the middle of writing the script, I swapped Harold's Kitty for this episode and put it in the number 1 spot. I remembered it being decently interesting, and an episode about how Ronda gets glasses, which was alright, but oh man, it's so much more than that. This episode not only gives us a great look into Ronda's character through her getting glasses and being put in a very different situation than she's used to, but it tackles some pretty complex topics about social statuses kids or even teens put each other into and the effects it can have on someone. And there's some very heavy real-world implications in this part of the episode that go so much further than just kids in real life might fall into these situations. But I'll discuss that in a little bit. For now, let's start off with how they portray Ronda in this episode. At first, she seems like the absolute worst. Super rude to people who want to sit next to her on the bus because they don't fit her standard of beauty or class, and how whiny she is to this nurse about how ugly she's going to be if she starts to wear glasses. Though, the joke where she freaks out at the nurse's appearance is really funny. And this is all shown off even more when we see her with her mom looking for glasses, acting extremely spoiled, but in this moment, you all of a sudden understand why. How her mom, even when looking through glasses, is trying to pick out the pair that makes her look the prettiest, and when she starts to freak out about her looks, her rich father, who doesn't appear in this episode but they're talking to him over the phone, tries to basically buy her love and make her happy through buying her things, and just casually buys a pony, and she is still freaking out about the whole situation even though that makes her really happy. And through all this, you completely understand why she acts the way she does, being in this family that basically spoils her and puts her priorities in the wrong place and makes her feel bad for her appearance, and tries to look for glasses for her, for which ones will make her the most pretty. And yeah, the episode doesn't focus on this aspect that much, but in this very short but informative scene, you really understand why Ronda acts the way she does. But this episode isn't about that. It's about how she acts towards other people based on aspects of her life and how that changes when she gets glasses. But they do such a good job setting up how she acts above everyone else because of her family and how it's worsened by trying to fit in to the social group in school. And then in the second half of the episode, when she doesn't fit into that popular group anymore due to her glasses, we see how her opinion of how she wants to represent herself and how she sees other people compared to her changes. And this is so much more interesting than I'm making it sound. After she gets glasses, we see her go on the bus once again, and she sees another popular girl in her usual seat who won't let her sit there for the same reasons Ronda didn't allow that other boy to sit there earlier. So she has to sit in the back with the rest of the kids classified as nerds. As they slowly show her become close with these kids, as she becomes more secluded and looked down upon by everyone else. And that's what makes it all so interesting. It's not just because of her interesting dynamic with these other geeks, and how she slowly opens up to them, realizing they're all on the same page, and they're people too, so she should be nice to them and treat them equally, but also because there's a lot of people who reject her initially because she still tries to act like she is the most popular person there when she just isn't. And this causes people to realize how phony she really is. The whole situation is so interesting, and there's so many aspects to look at it from. You can reasonably make the argument that a lot of the kids who reject her and call her a geek and don't want to be friends with her anymore wouldn't do that if she would have just manned up and not acted like she was above everyone else. But because she wouldn't do that, they used her glasses as an excuse to kick her out, when those other kids never really had the opportunity because they weren't popular to begin with. They were just put in this category and in this social class in the school from the get-go, which makes this episode one of the most multi-layered of the series because of how much you can take out of it. There's just so much to bite into, but because of all this, she decides she doesn't have to take it, because not only does she know what it's like to be treated like she's above everyone else, but she knows what it's like to be treated like a normal person when the rest of these kids don't. She decides to step up, and because the other kids have been so nice to her and are in the same boat, she drags them along and inspires them. It's all just so interesting, and with all those elements building up to make for a great viewing experience, with so much to bite into, we end up at the ending. Now let me make this perfectly clear, that this episode would have made it pretty high, and in the end of the day, probably would have made it to number one anyways, but its ending just left such an impression on me that I decided to put it at number one at the last second. When Ronda finally confronts the popular girl about sitting in the front of the bus, that whole confrontation and just the whole system where the popular kids always sit up front and the geeks sit in back is inspired by real-life 50s horrible segregation laws. And the final confrontation with this popular kid, in particular, is inspired by the Rosa Parks incident. Now, if handled wrong, this episode could have came across as incredibly insensitive and tasteless to use these real-life events as sort of allegories for this episode. But you know what? This episode handles that aspect really well. It uses this allegory in a respectful way to send a message that discrimination in any sense based off someone's looks is wrong. Kids will appreciate the ending because when everyone's allowed to sit where they want to, despite their looks or personal appearance, it'll send a good message, and they will have grown to like these characters over the course of the episode and realize that even though they're treated poorly based off of dumb things, that they're still people and deserve to be treated normally. And Ronda for changing her ways for everybody to have a better life. So they'll think that they deserve to get equality, and in return, it might lead them to thinking everyone deserves that same equality too. And as I said, it just sends a great message to show that discrimination in any way towards someone based on their appearance is bad. But older people who know about the Rosa Parks incident will appreciate that this episode uses that inspiration from those events to send a good message about anti-discrimination. And because there's just so much to unpack, it could possibly open up a dialogue between older and younger people who aren't as informed about those situations or about those times, and teaching more people about how important the Rosa Parks incident was for civil rights. I cannot praise this episode any further for how it uses its allegory to send such an amazing message in so many different ways, and that's what sealed the deal to make it one of the best and most thoughtful episodes of Hey Arnold. It is easily the best episode of season 2 and is shaping up to maybe be my new favorite episode of the entire series. But hey, season 3 is next, and that is my favorite season, so we'll see. But damn, is this episode incredible. And with that, the list is done. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like and subscribe for content similar to this in the future. I'm trying to post 2 of these lists a month, so any additional support would be very motivating. Also, leave a comment down below telling me what you thought of the video and what your own list would have been. Comments are fun to read, and criticisms always help, as long as it's respectful and informative. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Finally, a link to a playlist to all the music and remixes I used in this video is in the description, and all information about each of those pieces are in those videos. All images and music used in this video belong to their original creators. The top 5 best SpongeBob Season 3 episodes should be coming near the end of February, and with all that said, happy Valentine's Day. I'm gonna go watch Arnold's Valentines to see if it's still my favorite episode, and until next time, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.